Hi, I'm Kristen Grady, and I haven't posted anything in a while because I've been severely depressed. No worries, this happens all the time. I mentioned the film Quills in a recent blog post, and wouldn't you know it, I found the DVD at my local library. I listened to the director's commentary back in college, and this has always been one of my favorite movies. I hope you'll enjoy it too. Okay, this is Quills starring Geoffrey Rush as the Marquis de Sade, and Joaquin Phoenix as a priest, and Kate Winslet as a chambermaid. This was released in the year 2000. Oh, wouldn't you know it? Fox Searchlight Pictures. Quite an intro. And after their title again, we hear a woman breathing heavily over a few titles, a Philip Kaufman film. And we hear the Marquis's voice. Dear reader, I have a naughty little tale to tell. Sort of narrating the prologue here. And we see a blue sky and a woman with curly hair looking rather serene. We're not really sure what's going on with her yet because we just see her face. And she appears to be in a world of her own. Inflicting pain and pleasure with equal zest, says the Marquis's voice. And we see a pair of rough hands grab her by the throat. And behind her is an executioner in a black hood. And it's actually a guy in the insane asylum that we'll see later. And he takes off this woman's dress. He tears her shoulders down, then ties her hands behind her back. And she's dressed in French Napoleonic era clothing. And the executioner kind of like sniffs her neck. And we see the Marquis watching from a window with bars on it. And then the executioner puts the woman's head in a guillotine. And he places her hair gently next to her face. There's a crowd of people laughing at her. And they're bringing headless bodies away and taking off their jewelry. And this woman, who's probably like an aristocrat, she's never had to deal with anything, is looking down into a pile of heads. And tears are rolling down her cheeks. And there's like other aristocrats in a cart that are wearing like big wigs, but they've been beaten and jailed for a while, so they're a little rough looking. And there's a father playing a violin and two little kids singing and begging in the street. There's a big fat guy with mort tyrans, like death to tyrants in French, written on his chest in blood, it looks like. The aristocrat lady is in the guillotine, and the blade is above her, dripping blood onto her face, and she's very upset by this. But really, it's not the worst thing that's going to happen to you today. And the Marquis is humming the same song that the children are singing outside as he's writing in what looks to be red ink, but is probably not ink at all. He's sitting at his desk writing in blood, it looks like. Seems to be plenty of it around because of all the guillotining. And there's a drum playing in the crowd, and the blade drops and cuts off her head. And then it's like a splash of blood that fills the screen. We heard Kate Winslet say, "Your linens, please." She's opening a prison door and taking linens from, and it looks like there's a text that says, "The Charenton Asylum for the Insane years later." So that whole intro was a flashback to Napoleon's Reign of Terror, I think, is when they started just chopping off heads like crazy. And now Kate Winslet is working in the insane asylum where the Marquis is being held. And he's got a very nice cell. There's very nice furniture and stuff in his cell. She takes his linen and notices there's some paper in it. He says, "Careful, the ink's still wet." So it seems like she's smuggling his writing out of the insane asylum to be published still. And it has to be a secret because he's in prison, technically. Yeah, and he says, "Now hurry," while he looks through a peephole in the door. And there's an old blind woman who is Kate Winslet. Her character's name is Madeline. Her mom is the laundry lady in the basement of this place. And she's wearing a really cool corset from that era. It's like pink and really makes her boobs look amazing in this movie. Kate Winslet's boobs are like a fourth and fifth star of Quills. And she's smuggling the Marquis de Sade's writing out of the insane asylum underneath her shawl. And she runs to like the gate outside. And there's like a crazy guy with a shaved head brushing his shaved head like there's hair there. And he's looking into a mirror and wearing a dress. So most likely he was just transsexual. It was Napoleonic France, so they put him in an insane asylum because that's how they used to treat human beings back then. And there's Joaquin, because this big scary guy was threatening Kate Winslet, and Joaquin says, "Remember your manners." He was so cute, especially as a priest. And he's like playing ball with the crazy people. That's really sweet. And then Madeline goes to a guy on a horse with a leopard print saddle, which you don't see very much in that era, but you know, this is historical fiction. And they like discuss the Marquis' cut of the profits, because he's got really, everybody loves buying the Marquis de Sade's writing, and you can still read it. Like I actually haven't read it. This movie was plenty for me, I guess. But Justine is supposed to be like a really kind of feminist erotica novel from that era. And we get the word Sado-Masochism from Marquis de Sade, and it's got all sorts of different connotations now, but this movie is like historical fiction about the end of his life, which he spent in an insane asylum, because he would commit crimes all the time. You know, he would like assault people a lot. But he got away with it because he was an aristocrat and, like, he had the money. And there's people on the street, like, reading his work. And under, you know, Emperor Napoleon's rule, that was, like, a big, definitely don't do that. So Napoleon, it cuts to his palace, and he's getting, like, painted in a big ermine cloak and regalia and all that stuff. And there's like an advisor reading de Sade's writing to him, and it's like really sexual and kind of hilarious too. Oh, right. It's about like a priest putting a communion wafer on some girl's ass and then fucking her in the ass or something. And then this guy's like, "Must I continue?" So he can't take it. He loosened his manhood from beneath his robes. drove it into her very entrails. Yeah, because it's published under anonymous. He's like, we know it's the Marquis de Sade because of his writing and stuff. And Napoleon like throws the book in the fire, and he's like, we must torch them in public and stuff. They are like, we got to deal with this and not let this guy keep publishing his work. And they don't, yeah, they don't want to kill him because then they make him a martyr. So they just like want to shut him up. There's like guards ritualistically stepping across the room in front of him. Oh, and the advisor's like, you're just bringing a man to his senses, you know? It's like they lopped off so many aristocrats' heads, and that power doesn't go nowhere. And then they're gonna send this doctor who's played by Michael Caine to like deal with him, and he's like horribly brutal. Like they're showing him working in another insane asylum right now, and there's like a guy being dunked in a tank of water with like this iron medieval chair that he's strapped to, and like that's fucked up. And that's what they used to do to mentally ill people back then, is like they used to just torture them into shutting up about whatever it was that was bothering them. And like this continued until it was like the 70s or 80s when they finally were like, oh, we shouldn't be torturing people to shut them up about their mental illness. We should actually try to cure them. But Michael Caine's like just a sadist, basically. Like he likes inflicting pain on people because then they do what he says more, especially, you know, like insane people. He's just like taking advantage of them. And he's trying to say that like his methods are really effective, and he's talking about going to the asylum where the Marquis is, Charenton. And this guy's got like a big black scary looking carriage that he travels in, and he's got like a top hat and a black cape on and stuff, and it's like, what are you, Jack the Ripper? Something like that. And there's a church where the priest, Abbe Joaquin, is teaching Kate Winslet how to write. He's holding her hand on a quill, and he's right over her shoulder and her heaving bosom as he's teaching her so innocently. And she says, how can we know who's truly good and who's evil? He says, all we can do is guard against our own corruption. I had a friend in college who was really turned on by his cleft palate scar. She said she wanted to suck his upper lip. And she's not wrong. And Kate Winslet is reading some of the Marquis's writing to some other chambermaids and like servants, just like laying in a pile of hay, and they're like poor people clothing, and there's like a uglier looking girl who's like mad that she's reading it, and Kate Winslet's like, no one's forcing you to listen. Yeah. And she's like, he gazed upon her Venus mound. And now she's like reading at the girl who complained on purpose to like freak her out. And that's awesome too. And she's like, you've been in his quarters. And Kate Winslet's like, once or twice. And she says, he's a writer, not a madman. Yeah, a little bit of both. And they're like, oh, he's in there for murder. And she attacks him. She's like, that's not so. And they're throwing hay on each other. And the guys are saying, oh, and like people murdered their husbands and miscarried their babies because of his writing. And she's like, if you're going to slander him, you don't deserve to hear his stories. And the girl who was complaining before was like, oh, she's sweet on him. And the other girl's like, no, she likes the priest. And yeah, again, she's not wrong. And there's the big scary guy jerking off while he's watching them through a crack. A lot of voyeuristic kind of elements to this movie. And Dr. Michael Caine is traveling through the woods in his big, scary black carriage. And a guy with a scar on his face is like not happy that there's a new guy coming to be the boss. And Joaquin's like, no, it's all right. And there's like a room set up where the insane people are like painting, and there's a guy who's a pyromaniac painting a guy on fire. And he's like, it's far better to paint fires than to set them, isn't it? And the guy's like, yes. He's like giving them art therapy. He really cares about rehabilitation and therapy, which is unique for this era. And again, this is historical fiction, but it's nice seeing a priest who, treats people like human beings. And Madeleine is sneaking into the Marquis de Sade's cell now. And he grabbed her hand as she was reaching for his linens, and he has this like big, looks like an amber ring on his finger, and his like nails are really long and pointy. He's like, I don't know. He's very animalistic looking. He looks like a cross between a goat and a cat. And she's like, where are you? Where have you gone? She's in his cell and she can't find him now. And like there's nice art on the walls and tapestries and drawings and like nice furniture and stuff. Like this guy is like, his place is nicer than mine. And mine's not very nice, but neither of us have a fridge. And now Kate Winslet's looking around, and he has like this ottoman made of bones. And it looks like he was eating an orange on his chair. So and he's got like several dildos on his bookcase and a bunch of quills. So really he has everything he could possibly need. And there's like this Chinese ivory carving. There's like a dick on it that goes into the woman. I don't know. It's like this like erotic sculpture that he has. So it would probably be pretty fascinating to inspect the objects around the Marquis de Sade's cell. There's like a head made out of people and the Virgin Mary. Yeah, he's got a lot of nice stuff and like a canopy bed and so everybody kept telling me, the Beverly Hills jail is the nicest one. And I'm like, I don't care who you are. Being in jail sucks. And he's got like bones in his bed too. This guy likes bones. Oh, and then he's standing right behind her, and she's like, you didn't frighten me. He's got this curly wig on. It really does, I'm pretty sure in the director's commentary it said that he loved the wig because it made him look like a horny old goat or something. And Kate Winslet is like giving him the cut of the book that he sold before, and she was like, here's your profits before they started burning it. He says, if only these coins purchased your other talents. And she's like, there's something else I want from you. And he's like, you've already stolen my heart as well as some other prominent organ south of the equator. And she's like, I need another manuscript because people love his salacious stories. And this man, like, his real fetish is writing. And I can honestly relate to that. Like, having people read your writing is, it's not just a turn on, it's fulfilling in every aspect of that concept. And he's like, oh, and it's so fiendish and stuff. And she's like getting really excited to read it. And he's like, I must have a kiss for each page. He says, the price is every bit as firm as I am. And she's like, you talk the same as you write. Who doesn't? She gives him a little kiss on the cheek, and he's like a little disappointed. And he hands her one of the pages. She gives him another kiss on the cheek, and then he hands her another page, not looking like happy about that. And then he like grabs her face and kisses her on the lips, and she's like a little not into it, and he like bites her tongue, it looks like. She's kind of squeaking, like she's not happy about that. And then it cuts to Joaquin Abe, whatever his name is, and walking down the hall towards the Marquis's cell, and he gets intercepted by this guy who likes birds. He has like a bird cage. The crazy guy's like, there's but one kind of bird in a madhouse. And Joaquin says, don't tell me, a loon. Oh, that's a cute joke. Oh my God. And the Marquis is like sucking on Madeline's neck as she's sitting next to him, and he makes her sit on his lap for the last page. He makes the sound that I really like when she sits on his lap. And she's like not having it, but he's whispering in her ear that he wants to deflower her. And she smacks him in the face. She's like, some things belong on a page and not in life. Blessed fool who can't tell the difference. Good for you, standing up for yourself. She's like, you're in the nick of time, because Joaquin walks in finally. And she was like, he thought I was a character in one of his nasty stories. And then Joaquin says, next time you want to visit the Marquis, just come to a confession instead. And she's like, okay. And she's like taking the rest of his manuscript away to be published illegally. He's pouring Joaquin, the Marquis is pouring the priest a glass of wine and telling him that it's saying the grapes were crushed beneath the Virgin Bride or something. And the priest is like, uh-huh. And then he takes a sip of it, and he's like, this is from our cellars. Getting a little ahead of myself here. It's like insane asylums had wineries back then. Well, I guess it was cleaner than the water. And the Marquis is like, I should have told you it was the blood of Christ. You would have believed that, wouldn't you? The movie's funny. It's like a dark comedy. The Marquis's got his feet up on the bone ottoman, and he's sitting in his chair, and the priest is like, we gave you like a feather bed instead of a straw mattress, and like you've got all this nice stuff. All I ask is that you follow the rules. And he's like, you shouldn't have had the girl in your room. And the Marquis is like, oh, well, I'm entertaining you now. And he's like, but I'm not a beautiful young prospect. And the Marquis is like, oh, well, don't be so sure. Like, he definitely swings both ways because, again, his fetish is writing. I don't think that's specific to gender. And he's like, I feel page after page, my cherub. Because the priest doesn't know that the Marquis is publishing his work yet. That's what Michael Caine's going to deal with. And his big black carriage has just arrived at the insane asylum. And there's like the sound of a choir, a bunch of crazy people singing in the church choir as Joaquin is conducting. Again, quite adorable that he's so involved with these people's recovery that he has all of these extracurricular programs to help them, not only live a more normal life, but like express themselves and stuff. Like, this is really kind of cute that he's so into helping these crazy people. And this is back around the time he was in like Gladiator and stuff. It's Joaquin 20 years ago. So, damn. And Michael Caine has just shown up as the song is ending. All the crazy people are finishing the song, and it's really pretty and cute. He's like, oh, good job, everybody. And he goes to meet Michael Caine. He's like, this may be a little awkward, but I've come to oversee your work here. And really, he's going there to deal with the Marquis. And Joaquin's like, oh yeah, well, Tom will profit from us both. And Joaquin's like, why has the Emperor taken such interest in our affairs? And Michael Caine's like, a patient of yours has captured his fancy. And Kate Winslet was watching from like the wings. Because she's involved with that. Uh-oh. And Michael Caine and Joaquin are walking to the Marquis cell. And Michael Caine saying like all these women he mutilated and stuff like that. And he cauterized the wounds with hot wax. And Marquis is yelling in his cell at the guys, the other patients who are in his play. And this crazy guy's got a shoe and he's like reading these like nursery rhyme lines from a play called The Cobbler's Wife. This is another one of Joaquin's programs. They have a theater program too. Like, I've been to high schools that are this well appointed. And there's like the pyro guy's wearing a little like angel costume, and the guy who was wearing a dress before is now dressed like a woman, and she looks very happy. And Joaquin is like, oh, it has a lot of therapeutic value. And Michael Caine's not into it. As they're looking in through the window on the door. And the Marquis is looking at the doctor. He says, welcome to our humble madhouse, doctor. You shall find yourself right at home. And he closes the window in the door. And Joaquin is explaining to Michael Caine his wife pays for all of that stuff that he has. And Joaquin's like, oh, he has a lot of good stuff, music lessons and the library and watercolors and stuff. He's like, he no longer roars or spits or molests his fellow wards, so I guess he's doing better with all that. And he's saying his writing is essential to his recovery. And Michael Caine's like, do you favor its publication? And Joaquin's like, no, definitely not. It's unprintable. And then Michael Caine takes out his book, Justine, published by Anonymous. And the priest looks at it like, oh, shit. He says, all France is aghast at this book, and you've never heard of it. He says, silence the Marquis or Charenton will be shut down. Wow, he's going to shut down the whole place because this one guy's writing is threatening Napoleon. And Michael Caine says to flog the Marquis at the stake for the book. He's like, why? So he'll just learn to fear punishment? He's like, let me take this up with the Marquis myself. This insane assign is my life. And Michael Caine's like, can you personally guarantee this won't happen again? He's like, you have my word. Because he thinks he's friends with the Marquis. And Kate Winslet sees Joaquin in the hall, and she runs up to him. She's like, what's going on? And Joaquin's like, the Marquis has been slipping manuscripts to people. And she's like, what? How is he doing that? Definitely not me. And she looks very upset. The Marquis is just finishing a page of his writing as Joaquin slams the book down on his desk, and there's a look of delight on his face because he's seeing his book in print for the first time, and Joaquin's like, I'm very disappointed, and he's like, me too, the print is too small. Joaquin's like, you have no right to publish. He's like, have you truly read it? The Marquis really wants Joaquin to read his book. And Joaquin's like, it's nothing but an encyclopedia of perversion. It's not even a proper novel. He's like criticizing his work. He's like, you keep repeating words like nipple and pike staff. He's trying to like use literary critique to argue with him. It's like, you're pissing off Napoleon, dude. And he's going to shut down the whole place. So shut the fuck up. And the Marquis is like, we're human beings. This is what humanity is. We eat, we ship, we fuck, we kill, and we die. And Joaquin's like, but we also compose symphonies and stuff. And he's like, don't you want to elevate us above the beast? And he's like, nah, not really. And Joaquin's like, I'll be forced to revoke all your liberties. Because he's like, I don't want to lose my job because you're writing stuff that is pissing off Napoleon. He's like, there's more than your rights at stake. He's like, they've threatened us with closure. And he's like, oh, they can't be serious. And Joaquin's like, think about your fellow patients and me. And like, and he's like, they're going to die. And the Marquis is like, let them die on the streets. And he's like, if ever I showed you a kind hand, Marquis. The priest is like, how about me? Do you care about me? He's like, then you'll oblige me now for your sake and for all Charenton. And Marquis says, you have a touch of the poet in you. You should take up the quill. The priest is like, do I have your word? He says, you cut me to the core. He says, at last I pledge myself to righteous conduct. The people will get suspicious. And he just basically like, he's like, yeah, sure, I won't publish anymore. Because I'm pretty sure the Marquis de Sade is like a sociopath. Like he really just, he has rare moments of actually caring about people. And I don't know. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a psychiatrist. But neither is Joaquin, and here he is. He's actually doing a pretty good job. And Michael Caine's like, oh, you have the matter in hand, don't you? And he's like, yeah, I'm friends with the Marquis. It's all good. And Michael Caine shows up at a convent, and there's a nun there. And Michael Caine says, I've come for my bride. And the nun says, we haven't expected you for some time. And Michael Caine says, I've taken a new post at Charenton, and I need the succor only a wife can provide. And this lady goes in, and there's like a 16-year-old kneeling in front of her statue of the Virgin Mary. And the nun's like, he's come to collect you. And she's like, today? This minute? She's like, I'm 16. And Michael Caine's like, I apologize, I had no time to write. So he's like, basically bought this orphan girl who has been raised to be his wife. And the nun's like, be grateful, child. Poor girls never wed. They wind up spinsters, or worse, a nun. Not really happy about her choices, I guess. And she's like, be grateful that fortune has spared you from such a fate. She's still like, I've never met this guy before. I'm going to go marry him now. And she has her statue of the Virgin Mary. She gets into his big black carriage and rides away from the only home at this convent that she's ever known. And his 4 black horses are going over like a beautiful bridge in France. They're going to his chateau. And it was like, before Napoleon, it was all opulent aristocracy. So he's going up to like a rundown chateau in France right now that's by the insane asylum. And the caretaker's like, consider the chateau a gift from the emperor, and as long as you finance the necessary repairs. And then there's like a guy with some very stylish mutton chops who's like an architect there. And they go in, and it's like a wreck. You hear rats running around, and there's like leaves and branches, and everything is broken and covered in cobwebs. And it was like the working class rose up and stormed the chateaus for all the aristocrats that they wanted to behead. So like on the walls, written in blood, "Mort aux tyrans," like death to tyrants. And the caretakers like explaining how they had to drag out the lady of the house, and there's like blood streaks on the stairs where they dragged her. And Michael Caine tells the architect to quarry fresh marble. I'm guessing because it's hard to get bloodstains out of marble. I don't know. And Michael Caine is like, spare no expense and make sure that you lock, the door can lock from the outside and the window has iron bars on it so that he can lock his wife in her bedroom. And he's like, I have saved this girl for a long time, and she's a rare bird. I intend to keep her caged. And Simone is in this beautiful draped bed, and she's reading by candlelight. And she blows out the candle when she hears the door open, because here comes her husband, Michael Caine. He has a candle. And he's in like a nightgown. Puts the candle down on the end table, and he gets in the bed. And she's like pretending to be asleep very badly. It's like she's sweating because she's nervous because there's this old guy that she's never met who's a then he like basically starts raping her. He tears off her nightgown. He's like, the nun should have instructed you in the duties of a wife to her husband. And she just sort of clutches at her nightgown and doesn't struggle. It's very sad. She was looking at her Virgin Mary statue. She definitely did not consent to that. And the nuns are like gossiping with some like candle merchants. And they're like, oh, and she's only 16. And then like the servants who are listening to Madeline read the story before are all having sex together, 2 guys and a girl. And they're talking about how the doctor had, picked up his 16-year-old wife from a convent, and now he's got her locked in a chateau. And then later on, the girl from that trio is whispering the whole story to Kate Winslet, who's like, oh! And then she's whispering it to the Marquis through the window in his door. And she says, he's old enough to have fathered her twice over. And the Marquis is like, this has the makings of a farce. And then he's writing The Crimes of Love, a farce. And he's basically switching the play that they were working on before to like a parody of what's going on with the doctor and his new wife. And Joaquin's outside talking to some ladies in some big feathered hats. It looks like they're having a big theater night with the play. And the aristocratic lady's like, oh, I had no idea that actor was an imbecile. And he's like, yeah, we're very proud of them or something. And then the aristocrat ladies are even giggling about Michael Caine's very young wife. And the Marquis's wife gets off of her carriage. In her red cloak, she appears to be going in last. Because even though his writing is the sensation of this aristocracy, they're still very judgmental of her. And the Marquis is like psyching up the cast as they're like not really absorbing what's going on. And the Marquis is like, I hope they'll remember this forever. And there's it looks like crazy guys and stuff in a band off to the side, like funny sounding madrigal music. And there's like a theater in the round sort of stage in the middle, and people all around watching. And the Marquis's wife is in the front row. Joaquin leans over to Michael Caine and tells him that's the Marquis's wife in the red cloak. He's like, indeed. And the pyro guy is so happy because he gets to light the lanterns. And Kate Winslet takes the lit candle lighter thing away from him quickly backstage. And a guy introduces the play saying like, oh, there's been a change. We will not be performing The Happy Shoemaker. Instead, we'd like to premiere a new play in honor of the newly appointed Dr. blah, 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 French guy, and his new bride, Roya Collard. I can say it, but I don't want to. And the Marquis says, The Crimes of Love. And he's like, this has been written by the Marquis de Sade. And he comes out and like bows. He has a quill in his hand. He puts it over his heart. And then he bows. And he walks backstage like, huh, people love me. And there's a guy in some wings throwing feathers all over the place. And the big scary guy's like using a bellows thing from a fireplace to make it look like it's snowing, I guess. And there's the pyro guy is dressed like a nun, and he's riding like a little like hobby horse sort of thing, like a horse's head on a stick, like it's a horse. And the guy who is dressed like a girl is dressed like the doctor's wife, holding her little statue of Virgin Mary on another horse on a stick thing. And like the nun guy's like, oh, he's going to coach you in the ways of pleasure. And then the guy who's like the doctor comes up and says, at last she has arrived, my hard-won bride. And he's the guy, the play doctor is like, oh, we'll have such treasures for you here. And the bride is like, oh, well, I'm lucky to receive his charity. And then the doctor like pays the nun for the bride. You could just buy a wife back then. I suppose you could still buy a wife if it's not legal, but I mean, people do illegal things all the time. I don't know. I don't judge. I mean, as long as she has some say in it, do whatever you want. But this is obviously not her choice, and that sucks. But that's what the play is parodying, is that she's, 16, and he bought her and had her raised in a convent. And Joaquin's watching the play. He looks very nervous. He seems to be sort of fidgeting with his rosary, like, oh, fuck, we're fucked. Because the doctor's sitting there like, I get what's going on. And he exchanges a glance with the Marquis, and he's like, yeah, watch this. And then the play is like, the doctor's like, oh, look at my scepter, how solid it grows. And the bride's like, and then it starts to get really like campy sexual, and the doctor in the audience says to his young bride, he's like, you must leave at once, because he doesn't want her to watch this. And she's like, but it's just begun. Like, she wants to watch this because it like is very relevant to her life. And then in the play, the doctor goes under the bride's skirt as she's like, oh, what's going on? Oh, it's somewhere between shame and elation. And he's like, oh my goodness, that you use your tongue in the way of Sister St. Fond or something. He's like, I didn't realize your sister was graphic and sapphic, and he's like, oh, I'd tell you more, but it's too graphic. And it rhymes too, which is just delightful too. And they're like simulating all these sex acts on stage in front of the doctor, who was already pissed off about the Marquis's writing. And yeah, they're in big trouble now. And the Marquis is mad because their acting is bad. And Kate Winslet's backstage, like doing like stage manager stuff, like, everybody come quietly for the next bit. And they're still simulating sex acts on stage, and everybody in the audience is laughing because this is hilarious. Like, I would go see this play every night it was open, because this is just really funny, and they didn't have TV back then. And the big scary guy comes up behind Kate Winslet backstage, like he's going to grab her and do horrible things to her. He's sneaking up. Because he was the hangman at the beginning in the prologue, too. I forgot to mention that. And the Bouchard, I think his name is, this big scary guy is like attacking her, like he's about to rape her, as these fake sex acts are going on stage. And she grabs an iron from the fire and she hits him in the face with it so it burns his face, and he's like, ah! And then this big scary guy runs out into where the play is happening, and he's tearing the curtains down because he's been burned. And she's like, crying because he tried to rape her. And she's like, I'm fine. This breath made my eyes run, because he has like really gross teeth. And the priest is like hugging Kate Winslet, and he's like turns to Marquis. He's like, do you mean to take us all with you? Like, he just got them all in trouble for writing that. And the Marquis is like, it's only a play. And everyone starts applauding because they thought the guy getting burned was part of the act. Which really, that's improv right there. You can't plan something like that. And there's a mix of boos and clapping. Which I think today, if people don't like a play, they tweet about it. They don't boo. But everybody's like looking at the Marquis' wife like, oh, this is your fault. You're his muse. She's like, God damn it. And Michael Caine is yelling at Joaquin outside of the play. He's like, you're making a spectacle of these people. He's like, it's a sanatorium, not a circus. And he says, the theater is henceforth closed. And he's like, Michael Caine says, do more, or I shall inform the ministry that the inmates are running the asylum. Then they cut to the Marquis' cell, and Joaquin is looking at a quill as the Marquis is eating some food, and like, this is good. Like, he just doesn't care that all this chaos ensued from his writing. Like, that was like fun for him. He's like, one man is being so selfish. As he's just like eating and drinking his wine, and Joaquin's like, I can't take this anymore. You've left me no choice. And he starts packing up all of his quills. And the Marquis is like, wait a second, no, let's talk about this. He's like, I have all the demons of hell in my head, and my only salvation is to put them down on paper. Wow, I relate to that. And Joaquin's like, you should read more. A writer who produces more than he takes in, that's sure a mark of an amateur. And then he hands him a Bible, and Marquis like spits in it, and he's like, he strung up his own son, this God of yours, and he spits in the Bible, and he says, he strung up his own son like a side of veal. I shudder to think what he'd do to me. And Joaquin's like offended because he just insulted Jesus. And Marquis says, I'll die of loneliness if you take my quills. My characters are the only company I have. And Joaquin says, whores and pederasts? You should find better company, basically. And the Marquis is like bargaining. He's like, how about Madeline? Do you want her? And Joaquin's like, I don't know who you insult more, her or me. And Marquis is like, you can do it with a long, slow screw. And then Joaquin like walks out. He's like, wait, then bugger me. He's like, anything. He's like, have you ever... My writing flows like the beating of my heart, my constant erection. The Marquis is yelling as he's got his quills taken away. And then his wife comes the next day, and the Marquis is not happy because he hasn't been able to write. And his wife says, I've paid a visit to the craftsman, who laughed and called me a whore as she's holding a dildo. She's like, I don't know what you enjoy more, using these things or the humiliation I endure procuring them on your behalf. And she seems to enjoy it too, the way she's talking. She brings him some chocolates too. And I remember in the commentary it said that like the real Marquis de Sade was very corpulent at this point because eating is something that you do when you're trapped, I guess. And the Marquis goes up to his wife and said, I'll only eat them if they're bursting with cream. And he's like, sort of whispering in her ear and acting amorous. He's like, smacks her across the face. And he's like, you think I want bonbons? He's like, what I truly require, what I truly need is a quill and a pot of ink. And he's like throwing shit around. She's like, how did I know? How should I know? And he's like, what was I supposed to do, right? Then he grabs her by the face. He's like, I've been raped far more egregiously than any of my wretched characters. And she's like, how would I know? And he's like, what am I supposed to do, right you? They took my quills. And she's like, you've got to stop making such a spectacle of yourself. And he's like, she has a prison, that's her whole life. And he hates the doctor because he knows that he's behind the quills getting taken. She's like, my prison is far crueler, it has no walls. They point and whisper. At the opera, they hiss at me when I take my box. The priest refused to take my confession. He said I was already damned. Why must I suffer for your sins? And he's like, that's the way of all martyrs, isn't it? She's like, let me be visible again. I can't go back. He's like, have you ever done anything to secure my release? No. Have you sought audience with the emperor? And she's like, how can I? He refuses to see me. He's like, oh, you could hoist your skirts or put your mouth to the one good use it has. And he's yelling at her and shaking her. And she like reaches for him as he's like, yelling at her. And she's like, oh, take her away and put her among the hysterics. And he says, lock her up as well so she know how it feels. The Gorgon, the sow. And he's like breaking down crying. Another thing from the commentary I listened to before was that that's his actual wife. That's Geoffrey Rush's wife, the actress who played the Marquis's wife. And when he smacked her, they were like, wow. And she's like, we've been practicing at home. Wow. But Michael Caine is back at the chateau, and the architect is telling him, Peruvian marble will cost a lot of money, and you haven't given me enough. The architect is very young and handsome, and Michael Caine is not, but that's who his wife ends up being interested in, is the architect. And Michael Caine is talking to the Marquis's wife, who just rushed in, like, I need to talk to you, because I can't take this anymore. She's like, you can see me now. Your every waking moment is governed by the insane. Yeah, I don't know what that's like. And she's like, you've heard of my husband and his unusual case, right? And Michael Caine's like, all right, just give me a moment alone with this lady. Because he's like, I need money, and I'm going to get it out of this lady, basically. And they sit down in some very fancy chairs. The architect closes the door as the workmen leave, and Michael Caine's wife is coming down the stairs. Very young girl, and she smiles at the architect. But he's not noticing that because he's talking to Marquis's wife. And she says, it is my dearest wish that he remain entombed forever. And when he dies, I hope he's left as carrion for the rodents and the worms. And he's like, wow, I didn't realize you felt this way. And she says, if you can't cure him, truly cure him, then harness the beast that rages in his soul. And Michael Caine is like, that is not easily done, madam. Are you aware how much it costs for alternative treatments, like dunking him in water and shit like that? And she's like, I already pay his stipend like far more dutifully than I should. It's like, you have money to go to the opera, lady. And Michael Caine is like, oh, but we could use restraints, and we could, perhaps if you could buttress your entreaties with the means to oblige. Oh, he's like, oh, you have a pension from the sale of his books. So the doctor is very opposed to the publication of his books, but not using the money from the publication of his books. And she's like, but it's tainted money. And he's like, but wouldn't it be great if it went to his rehabilitation where I just torture him? And she's like, oh, saving someone's soul shouldn't carry a price tag. And he's like, imagine your friends deigning to kiss your hand again. And then he kisses her hand. He's like, and he's like, oh, don't you want people to be nice to you again? And she's like, don't toy with me, doctor. And he's like, oh, and you'll be renowned as the most renowned philanthropist rather than Satan's bride. And he's leading the Marquise outside, and he says to the architect, the Peruvian marble for sure, because he just got her to agree to pay for like his new house, basically, the repairs on his new house. And she's like, you want to know the cruelest trick he's ever done? Once, long ago, in the folly of youth, he made me love him. See, she's as into it as he is. That kind of relationship can exist. And the Marquis is looking around his room for any ink or quills or anything because he's desperate to write. I relate. And he gets a small Cornish hen on a plate from Madeline as she slips that through his food door. And he's like, can't you slip me a quill? And she's like, I can't. The doctor's got his eye on you now. So the Marquis is very upset as he's pouring himself a glass of wine with his rather delicious-looking chicken dinner. He spills his wine as he's pouring too much of it. He's sipping it, looking at the wine dripping on the white linen napkin that the tray had. And he sort of like prints the spilt wine, like the circle of the bottom of the glass on the white napkin, and he realizes, wait, and he tears the wishbone out of the chicken. Like he's just tearing open the Cornish hen with his hands, and he takes the wishbone out, and he like sucks the meat off of it, and he holds it between his fingers, and then he starts humming that song that he's always humming when he's writing. And he's got a glass of wine in his hand with the chicken bone, looking at his white bed sheet. He lays down on the bed and starts writing with the chicken bone in the wine, using the wine as ink. And he starts writing about the doctor, writing a parody of the doctor, saying that like he's got a really small dick. It's like what he starts off with. Because that's how men write. And he's like, oh, he's got everything. He's got all the fortunes were large as his others were small or something. And Michael Caine's like saying all the great things that he's doing for the house. You're like, oh, tapestries arrive. And he says to Simone, doesn't that please you? And she's reading a book. She's like, very much. She does not care. And he's like, oh, let's go and have brandy before the fire. And she's like, I'd rather read, thank you. And he says, you prefer a book to your husband's company? He's like, well, no wonder, I'm only flesh and blood. That's no match, is it, for the printed page? He's like mad because she doesn't want to be subjected to whatever he wants to do with brandy in the parlor. And she's like, ugh. And then he walks away and switches back to the Marquis's room, and he's like asleep on the bed sheet with writing all over it with the chicken bone and his empty glass of wine in his hand. And Madeline is there. She asks for his linens. She says, now or never. And he hands her the sheet that has his writing all over it. And she's like, oh, she's really excited because she loves his writing too. She's so excited that he's getting around the restrictions. And she walks away quickly as there's a guard by the Marquis's door now. And he was eating some chicken as she was running away. And Madeline's in the laundry room, and now she's transcribing the Marquis's writing from the bedsheet onto the onto paper. And her blind mom is sitting there knitting, and she's like, oh, read me some. And she was like, oh, this guy's a habituary of cemeteries. And his recent prospect was deceased a dozen years. So she's reading a story about necrophiliacs. People who like to have sex with dead people, I guess. And she's like, oh, I don't want to say the last part. And the mom's like, come on. He said, it caused her bones to dislodge. He had granted her the highest compliment he awarded any woman. Well worth the dig. And they both laugh at it because I guess that's kind of funny. I think they're laughing way harder because, again, they didn't have TV back then, so I guess their threshold for entertainment was lower. And the big scary guy is still watching them, and he's got a burn on his face. He looks angry. And Madeline is at the gate giving the manuscript from the bedsheet to the guy with the leopard print saddle. And she's like, oh, haven't you a name? And he's like, oh, I'll tell you if you ride away with me someday. And she watches him ride away. The manuscript kind of like she wishes she could. Like she works there. She's not a patient or an inmate or whatever. But she's like just as trapped as them. And they're singing while they're hanging up laundry, and they see like this very purple sheet amidst all the white ones, and now all the sheets are stained purple. So they found that out rather quickly. And Kate Winslet is like, oh, it was my blind mom who was doing those sheets. Nobody knows why it's like that. And Kate Winslet's like, I'm a laundress, not a detective. Like she's trying to play dumb that she didn't know what happened. All the sheets are stained. And he holds up the Marquis's sheet behind a candle. And he's like, maybe these sheets once belonged to our friend the Marquis. And Madeline's like, we have over 200 beds. That could be anybody's. And he's like, in his thread count and his own script, she's lying. It shows on her face. And she's like, shit. Because she's caught now. And now they're clearing everything from the Marquis's cell. Taking all of his furniture. And Joaquin's like, everything. And make sure his entire room is stripped bare. And the Marquis's like, you took my bed. Am I to freeze to death? The Marquis's just pissed off at everything. Because they keep taking his stuff. Because he keeps breaking the rules and he can't help himself. He's like, fine, take it all. He hands a candlestick to Joaquin. He's like, here, careful, this is slippery. You have no idea where it's been. And he throws the Virgin Mary in a box. He's like, here, the whole religion's built on an oxymoron. Virgin birth. And he's like, no more wine for you. Just water at every meal. And he's like, water? It's like, you're an insane asylum. You're lucky to have wine. And Joaquin's like, this is only for your own gratification. And the Marquis says, we're all lined up waiting for the crunch of the blade. The rivers of blood are flowing beneath our feet. I've already been to hell, young man. You've only read about it. So he's using the violent era in which he grew up as an excuse for his continued violent tendencies. He's like saying, hey, suppose you only put it in her mouth, and then Joaquin attacks him and looks like he's about to strangle him. He's like, you pious little worm. He's yelling as Joaquin's walking away. In conditions of adversity, the artist flourishes. Like, he's just making it worse by taking more privileges away from him. Like, he's going to find a way to write something because that's all this guy has. And Simone is walking through a market, and there's like a dwarf prostitute. Like, if I can pleasure myself, I can pleasure you. You don't know what you're missing, darling. It's like, good for you. And Simone goes into a bookshop, hands the guy a note, and he says, I've only got one copy left. Save it. Rescued it from the fire. She's asking for the Marquis book because she liked this play. She gets Justine. He hands her a copy. And he's like, a sweet little thing like you shouldn't be reading such filth. And she's like, I grew up in a convent. Everything I know in the world, I owe to books. And she rips out like a book from the cover of another book. It says Lady's Garden of Verse. And she glues Justine into that book cover so that she can, it's kind of like hiding a comic book inside your math book, you know. And we hear the Marquis's voice reading the text as she's reading it. A woman's power lies elsewhere in the velvet cavity betwixt her thighs. Ugh. It's hard to say these lines as I'm hearing them. You just have to watch the movie. The Marquis is looking into... apparently they left a mirror in his room, and he punches it. And he takes a shard of glass. It's like, I thought that they were supposed to take everything from his room. He didn't take the mirror. He takes a piece of glass and pricks the end of his finger with his long, pointy nails. And he drips some blood onto a bigger piece of glass, and he starts humming the song that he always hums when he's writing. And he gets a big pool of blood from his fingertip and starts, like, tracing with the one piece of glass in the blood so that he knows he can use his own blood as ink. And Madeleine knocks on his door quietly, saying, I have breakfast for you. She has like a bowl of oatmeal. And his fingers are all torn up, and he's got like bandages ripped from his clothes on there. He's like all gray because he's been using his own blood. He's like, I have something for you. It's like, if you have an ounce of pity in your heart, you'll throw caution aside and bring me a quill. Because he's like literally using his own blood to write. He's like, don't be a dunce, child. I have a surprise for you. Open the frigging door. I didn't realize they said frigging back then. You should just say fucking. Or is this PG-13? This can't be PG-13. I don't know. Kate Winslet goes in his room, and he's like on an empty bookshelf. He's like, look, my newest book. And is like, all of his clothes are covered in writing in his own blood. He's like, the longest sentence runs the entire length of my inseam. It's like even down his stocking. he says, it all completes itself at the base of my right shoe. And his face is all gray because he's lost so much blood. And he's like, look, and she's kind of delighted. And she starts reading his clothes, and he like brings her in close, and she's like, no, wait, I'm reading. And she like looks on his back, and like the look on his face is just so happy that she's reading. Like that turns him on more than anything, is that she's reading his work. And she's so happy. She's like, you're a genius. And he's like, yeah. And she kisses him on the lips. And he's like, you gotta go quickly, so you don't be blamed for my misbehavior. And then the girl who was not happy that she was reading in the beginning was like, I caught you. And then the Marquis slips out the open door and runs through the hallway like, haha, I'm free. And he goes into the cafeteria with all the insane people clapping for him. He's up on the table showing them all his new work on his clothing. And he's like, look, there's 2 chapters, one for each cheek, as he shows them his butt with the writing all over it. And he's like dancing around the table. And he shouts, my writing lives! And they're all like cheering and clapping for him because they're big fans. They have very little entertainment, even with all of Joaquin's programs and stuff. But then he faints because the Marquis has been using his own blood for ink. And Michael Caine shows up and says, take this beast back to his cage. And Marquis is like, oh, you've come to read my trousers. He's like, oh, what do I get now? A night on the rack? And Michael Caine says, I will not sully my hands with him. And the Marquis says, oh, yes, that's the first rule of politics, isn't it? The man who orders the execution never drops the blade. And then the Marquis is sitting in his cell, and Joaquin's yelling at him. He's like, what in God's name am I to do with you? The more I forbid, the more you're provoked. And Marquis is just like laughing. And Joaquin says, strip. So now he's getting his clothes taken away. And the priest turns away, and the Marquis throws his jacket at him, and he takes his vest off, and he throws his vest at him. He takes his shoes off, and he's like looking right at him as he's taking his clothes off. And he takes off his ring. He licks it first and then takes it off, and he puts his ring in his mouth. And the priest grabs it. He says, your breeches as well. He tries to turn away. He grabbed his arm and he makes him watch as he takes his breeches off. He says, we started this game. We must finish it, or haven't you the courage? And his wig is like falling off, and he looks really dirty and gross and gray still from all the blood loss as he's making Joaquin watch him get naked. He looks like kind of traumatized. And now he's just wearing the wig. That's all the Marquis got on, is that wig, as he's circling Joaquin, who's just staring forward with tears in his eyes. It's like, it's a potent aphrodisiac, isn't it? Having power over another man. And Joaquin's like, your wig. Because even that is not safe in the hands of the Marquis. And then he takes the wig off and he puts it over his junk. And Joaquin's like, God damn it. And he grabs the wig away from him. He doesn't say God damn it, but he's not happy that he has to do that. And the priest says, you'll no longer spread your insidious gospel. You will never even write your own ignominious name. And the Marquis says, is your God so flimsy, so weak for shame? And Joaquin's like, you don't flatter yourself. You're not the Antichrist. You're nothing but a malcontent who knows how to spell. Ho! See, like, that's smart. It's don't criticize his morality, criticize his writing. That's what really gets to him. See, I think that Joaquin understands psychology somewhat, at least better than Michael Caine does. Or at least he doesn't have the desire to exploit as much as he... And Kate Winslet is getting whipped with like a cat o' nine tails, so it looks really painful as everyone's watching and flinching every time she gets hit. But the big scary guy who tried to rape her is like smiling like he's enjoying it. And Joaquin realizes what's going on. He runs up. He's like, wait, no, cut her down. And Michael Caine's up in a window. He's like, leave her duly strung. And Joaquin gets mad and he starts taking off his shirt, which he could do anytime he gets mad and be fine with it. He's like, if you must shed blood, then shed mine. And he tries to take her place. So valiant, so shirtless. And there's the guy with the whip is about to start whipping Joaquin. And Michael Caine says, oh, no, that won't be necessary. Don't martyr yourself for... If you're going to martyr yourself, do it for God, not a chambermaid. He's such a dick. He's like, now put your clothes back on. It's like, Joaquin immediately went and got naked in front of a crowd when he had to make the Marquis get naked. I'm just saying, you know, that manifested in some erratic behavior on his part. And Kate Winslet is getting her whip wounds repaired. And he's like, oh, if I had realized that you were going to read his work, I wouldn't have taught you to read. And she's like, oh, it's a hard day's wage slaving away for insane people. You know, reading is my salvation. She said she puts herself in his stories. She plays the parts. Each strumpet, each murderous. If I wasn't such a bad woman on the page, I couldn't be such a good woman in life. Yeah, but you can't live through your characters forever, sweetie. She's got like really horrible lash marks on her back, and he's looking at her through the curtain. He feels bad because she's got really nice boobs. I understand, Joaquin. I think everybody does. It's fine. We all looked. And then Simone is listening to Michael Caine blather on about the plans for the restoration of the chateau. And she's watching the architect show her different tapestries. And she's like, I don't care about tapestries. She says, are you a literary man? He says, excuse me? I do so admire men with an appetite for books. And she hands him the Justine copy and the cover of like Ladies' Garden of Verse. And he's like, oh my goodness. He's like, you should be reading this. How could you? And there's like very graphic drawings in it. He's like, have you actually read this book? She's like, I've memorized it. And he's like, holy shit. And he's like a little impressed and also like scared because this woman's husband is right there and he's paying him. He's like, there comes a time in your life when you must cast books aside, learn from experience. And she's like, that, monsieur, requires a teacher. Somebody's ought to teach it. Madeleine is sleeping in her bed, on her, like, wounded back, too. You'd think that she'd, be sleeping on her stomach with all those lash marks. But she gets up in the middle of the night in her nightgown, with her shawl on. She's walking down the dark hallway. Some insane people are getting dragged back to their room. It's like, that's her whole life. She just probably grew up there since the blind lady is her mom. So she's been doing laundry and cleaning up after crazy people her whole life. And she runs into Joaquin's room, and he's just wearing a shirt. She stands by a candle, and she's like, don't send me away. Oh, because he wanted to send her away because she got whipped for helping the Marquis, and he wants to save her. He's like, you want to stay for the Marquis? And she's like, Mother's not half so blind as you. It's like, she wants to stay for you, you idiot. Joaquin. And Joaquin says, there are certain feelings we must not voice. And she says, why not? Because he's a priest. And he's like, we shouldn't act in ways as they're getting really close to kissing. And she kisses him, and they kiss very passionately. And then he breaks away. She's like, oops, what have I done? He's like, you better go to your room quickly. She's like, oh, you'll hate me now, won't you? And he's like, no, I love you. As a child of God. That last part's not true. She's like really crying and sad now, and he's like, oh, forgive me. And he closes the door. And he's breathing very heavy, trying to compose himself, and then he runs back out into the hallway and says, Madeline. And it's the girl who doesn't like her. And then he ducks back in his room, and the girl's like, oh, well, she's fucking the priest now, huh? Kind of with their looks. And Madeline's pulling down laundry from the line and sees a priest there. Joaquin. And she gasps. She's like, you don't fear the Marquis' sway on me. You fear your own. And Joaquin's like, let me explain myself. And he reaches for her, and she's like, don't come any closer. God's watching. Yeah, that's probably what I'd say, too. The disdain with which she says that is like, yeah, that's frustrating. And the architect is sitting in a chair with, looks like Simone is underneath the table giving him a blowjob as he's reading a letter to the doctor about how all the fancy things that he wanted to the house done are done. And then it looks like he comes in her mouth, and she's like, comes up from underneath the table, and she like wipes her lip. And she says, what else? And he's like, I'm no fool. A prison's still a prison, even with Chinese silk and chandeliers. Ugh, why can't I say that? She says, tell him that if he comes and finds us, you'll slit your wrist with a razor, and I'll plunge a hat pin through my heart. And he's like, you would do that for me? And she's like, no, but tell him I would. And she says, sign it quickly, so you can ravish me again on the linens for which he's so dearly paid, because they're going to run away together. And the architect's like, let's go do it on the bearskin rug in his study and leave puddles of love on the Peruvian marble that he, like, exploited from the Marquis' wife from the sale of his books. And the letter was stuck in a quill in the, like, lion door knocker of the chateau. And the doctor comes back and he reads it and he starts yelling, Simone, but she's long gone. I guess that door that locks from the outside and the bars on her window doesn't keep out architects, huh? And he looks in her lady's garden of verse and sees that it's Justine, and he starts tearing it up because the Marquis' words had corrupted his convent-raised wife. And he throws the pages in the air, and you see some float down. It says, sign of a pikestaff, such fine nipples, her legs widespread, her Venus mound, and like the graphic drawings and stuff. And then goes to the Marquis in the chair from the beginning that Michael Caine was dunking the insane guy into. And now it's the Marquis like, wait, I'll write children's stories. He's trying to get them to stop torturing him. He's like, oh, you love this, don't you? You're straining your trousers. You self-righteous fuck. Like every time they bring him up, he's just yelling obscenities. He's like, you're just more deeply rooting my principles. It's like, yeah, this guy's into S&M. You're not really doing much by torturing him. It's kind of making it worse. And the Marquis curled up naked in his cell now, in the dark. He looks out the window, and he says, haven't you seen a man naked before? And Madeleine is there, and she looks very sad because he looks very sad. He says, the Abbe is sending me away. And the Marquis says, of course he is, because she was the last thing that he liked there. And she says, Marquis, please tell me one last story. And so she liked his stories. That was her only entertainment. And he walks up to the window, and he's like, how am I supposed to do that? With dust upon the air. She's like, whisper it to me now. He's like, no, that's far too dangerous. She's like, I'll never see you again. Let me transcribe it for you so that I'll have something to remember you by. And he's like, this is neither the time nor the place. We've lost. Oh. She says, I never thought I'd see you defeated. He's like, oh, well, we'll never live to tell. And then the Marquis looks down the hallway at all the insane guys in the different cells. And he's like, wait, perhaps I can. He's like, position yourself in the laundry room with a bottle of ink and a quill, and you'll have a story that will make the angels weep, and the saints will gasp for air. Now it's pouring rain outside, and Madeleine puts a pair of scissors in a basket. She takes out ink and a quill. She has a candle next to a basket of laundry. And there's rain pouring outside in the night, thunder and lightning. And the guy in the cell next to the laundry room is the guy that tried to rape her. So he's at the end of this game of telephone that they're doing, because the Marquis is like 5-6 cells away. Yeah, I think it's 5 cells away. Like all the different inmate or patients or whatever they call them are... like the Marquis is whispering it to get the guy in the cell next to him, who thinks he's a bird. He's like sitting on a little trapeze swing in his room. He's like, I woke up to discover I turned into a sparrow. And he's the guy with the bird cage. And the Marquis is like, I just discovered I turned into a cat. And if you don't do what I say, I'll sink my fangs into your thigh and suck out the marrow. So the sparrow guy's like fluttering his fingers, and he's like, oh, it's okay, I'll what have you got? And the Marquis says, to my beloved reader, prepare yourself for the most impure tale ever to spring from the mind of man. And he's like, off you go. So the guy goes to like the crack on the other side of the cell where the pyro guy is next to him, who's Dauphin. And he's like, I prepare yourself for the most impure tale ever told. So it's changing every time that they're transferring it through people. And then Dauphin says, prepare yourself for an impure tale. And then the last guy is the big scary guy who also seems kind of slow. And he's like, prepare yourself, to Kate Winslet. And she's like, what? Bouchon, what did you say? He says, prepare yourself, I have a tale, an impure tale. So she starts writing what the Marquis is whispering through these several different guys. And he's telling a story about a woman with a tight, tiny fissure between her thighs and a cleft ass ever to be molded by the hand of God. Oh, she was a prostitute. Of course she was. And she had a tight, downy fissure between her eyes. And the story changes every time it goes through one of these insane guys. And he's like, my glorious prose filtered through the minds of the insane. Who knows, they might improve it. Which is my favorite line in this movie. Bouchot says it's about a harlot. Beauchamp's first client was a surgeon. And they're like all whispering between the cells, and it's like going down the hallway. You just hear these like desperate whispers of the Marquis de Sade's writing. They're all getting it wrong. But they're really enjoying this, that they're all being entertained. And Bouchot is like looking down Kate Winslet's cleavage, which honestly, I can't blame him either, because that corset makes her boobs look amazing. I must reiterate that. And the Marquis describing the prostitute's succulent oyster. And they all get that line, right? Succulent oyster. She's like, which hole, my mouth, my ass, or my succulent oyster? They all get that one right. That imagery made it through the minds of 5 insane men. And none, cried the surgeon. I'll carve more where there was none before. Remember, this is a Marquis de Sade writing, so. And the surgeon was obliged to tear out her tongue. And the Marquis is laughing. He's really enjoying this now. And they're like, she screams so loud. He felt he should takes a poker from the fire. And the word fire was the wrong word to say to the pyro guy, who reaches through the crack in this cell that he's whispering through to grab the candle from the other guy's room, which Joaquin is not allowed to have candles because of his proclivity for fire. So he's really happy that he has the candle. He's like, from the fire. So this his pyromania is triggered, and now he's got a lit candle, and he puts it on his bed, which immediately bursts into flames because it's straw. And he's very excited by the fire, but now he doesn't know what to do because his bed's on fire. And he starts yelling, fire, because he's very happy, but also he knows he's in trouble, and he's like dancing around. And the guy in the next cell is like, what's the next bit? Like, he doesn't even care that there's a fire. Like, he just wants to hear the rest of the story. And all the workers are running up like, oh no, there's fire. And they have lit torches in their hands because they need to see the fire with the fire. And then he's like yelling, get some water. And Dauphin runs out as soon as his cell opens, and he's got a torch, and now he's lighting more fires. Yeah, he puts the torch on the bed of the guy in the next cell, and he's like, they're trying to put out the fire, and Dauphin's starting more. Because you'd think the Marquis would have the foresight not to include fire in his story, but no. And Dauphin is running around setting fires everywhere, and all the insane people are out now, and they're just running amok. And Madeleine is in the laundry room. She's like, Bouchot? Oh no, his door is broken. So the big crazy guy who tried to rape her before is now free, and his wound from the hot iron that she hit him with looks infected. So he's crazy and gangrenous, and she starts screaming as he's grabbing her and hurting her. And the Marquis yells, Madeleine, because he's the only one still locked in his cell because there's nothing to light on fire in there, I guess. And now they're all yelling Madeleine, and the priest gets up from his bed because he hears them all yelling her name. And the doctor is just sitting and drinking wine, like, what the hell is going on, and doesn't care. Like, the whole place is burning down, dude. You're supposed to be in charge. And Joaquin runs down the stairs as all the crazy people are running out. And Dauphin still has a torch. Take the torch from him! And Joaquin's running around with his shirt off, or open, which, not complaining, but... And the girl who didn't like Madeleine is screaming, "It's her fault. The devil's unleashed himself upon us. It's her fault." And Michael Caine hears Madeleine yelling because she's getting attacked by Bouchon, and he's like, doesn't do anything because he's like, oh, let her die. He doesn't care. And the Marquis is yelling for Madeleine. And he just closes the window on the laundry door that she's being attacked in. And Madeleine's blind mom is standing on the stairs. And the guy in the dress is riding the shoulders of another guy, and there's like people making out in the rain. It's like they're kind of having the time of their lives out there, except they're trying to rape the other laundry girl, and Joaquin saves her from the crazy guys who are trying to hurt her. He's like and there's like a naked lady just dancing in the background in the rain. And then Joaquin runs through the rain. He seems a little disoriented. And he just yells, "Madeleine, you'd think he'd check the laundry room. That's where she works." And he goes to the Marquis and she says, "Go, quickly." "Yeah, why'd you go to the Marquis? You should have gone to the laundry room." And Madeleine's mom is like, "Where are you, Maddie?" And he looks and sees the paper that she was writing on is covered in blood. And what she had just written was, he felt he ought to tear out her tongue. And Joaquin runs over to the vat where the laundry is, and Bouchot's running up the stairs. He says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't help it." And there's like the overflowing laundry vat in the background that Madeleine's mom has the big fork where they stir the laundry with, and there's like blood, and it's apparent that Kate Winslet is at the bottom of this laundry vat, and she's very dead at this point. Yeah, she's dead. And Joaquin's holding her dead body and crying now. It's not really apparent how she died, but it was probably very violent and upsetting. Joaquin holds her body and cries a lot. And the guy who, with the leopard print saddle, rides up to the gate, expecting to see her there. Too late. You should have rescued her from that place a while ago, but you were making money, didn't you? And he looks in, and there's just like crazy people throwing shit out the windows because the whole place is on fire. There's like smoke coming out of it still. And he's like, "Where's the manuscript?" He yells for Madeleine, but she's dead. He rides away, and then there's Madeleine under a shroud. Looks like in the chapel as the priest says prayers in Latin over her. She's dead, but she still has a sex scene. Hang in there. And the workers come into Bouchot's room. They're like, now, don't be shy. We have a nice surprise for you." And he's like, "Huh?" And they close him into an Iron Maiden. And then they lock it, and then close him in a cell. Like, they used to do this to crazy people all the time. Like, this guy's a violent criminal, but he's also, like, got a mental illness. And they're just locking him up. Michael Caine says, "Oh, he's merely one of nature's experiments gone awry." It is our duty to mind such thing on his behalf, is it not? And Joaquin looks very traumatized. He's like, as you say. He was so impressed with the Marquis's tale that he chose to reenact it, didn't he? There was a chambermaid. Perhaps you would be so kind as to remind me of her name. And he's like, don't make me say it. Her name, Abbe. He says, Madeline. See, this guy is more of a sadist than the Marquis de Sade. The doctor is like torturing him with the guilt he feels over her death. And he lays down the bloody paper that said he tore out her tongue. So now Joaquin has an idea of how to deal with this. And he goes down to like a dungeon where the Marquis is being kept now. And he says, murderer! The Marquis is naked in a dungeon with rats, and he's got a chain around his neck. And the priest has a torch, and he says, your words killed that girl. He's like, oh, for fuck's sake. Suppose if one of your inmates chose to walk on water and drown, would you condemn the Bible? He's like, an innocent girl is dead. He's like, I'm blessed, am I not? So few writers get such concrete clarification for their work or something. And he's like, you loved her too. And he's like, I wanted to fuck her, that's all. And the priest says, why was it that you never took her by force? And he's like, I did. I fucked her countless times, the Marquis says. And all the while, she pleaded for more. And Joaquin says, I inspected the body. She died a virgin. It's like, was that really a priest's job back then? I don't think so, but he had to know. And that's what gets to the Marquis. He starts crying. The Marquis de Sade is crying because the girl he wanted to fuck died a virgin because she played out all of her fantasies through his writing. And now he's on the floor sobbing because that got to him. Finally, there was something that got through to him. He was like, oh, this is great. Somebody was murdered from my writing, until Joaquin was like, and she died a virgin. And that gets to him. And the Marquis says, give her a proper burial in a churchyard at my expense. I will not inter her sweet body in the same ground as the devils who would inhabit this cursed place. It's like, that's not really going to make up for it. She's dead. And Joaquin's like, oh, seems like you're a man after all. And then the Marquis spits at him. It's like, fine. And then there's a doctor sharpening a blade on a whetstone. He says, I have opium to numb the pain. And Joaquin says, our intention is punitive. If you numb the pain, what's the point? So the Marquis is strapped to a table. And there's two guys there. One has a clamp, and the other has a really sharp knife. And he's like, would that I was so easily silenced. And that's the last line that he speaks in this, because they clamp down his tongue. And then the camera pans away, and we hear him screaming horribly as they cut out his tongue. And Joaquin closes the door to where his tongue is being torn out. And he starts hitting his head on the door as he's listening to the Marquis' screams. Because at one point, he thought that guy was his friend. And he encouraged his writing because it was therapeutic. And now Joaquin is in his room flagellating himself with a whip as he's shirtless again over a Bible. Because that's what priests did back then. They might still do it. I don't know what they're into these days. And then he takes the Marquis' tongue in a jar to the doctor and puts it down on his desk. And the doctor says, my, you have exceeded my expectations. And Joaquin says, I'm not the first man God has asked to shed blood in his name. And the doctor says, will you sleep soundly tonight? And he says, no, I never expect to sleep again. Oh, Joaquin's traumatized. And then he's walking into the chapel where Madeleine's body is laid out under a very sheer shroud. And it seems that they took off all her clothes to lay her out for this burial and did not put clothes back on her, which I don't think was ever a custom. Like, you find mummies from thousands of years ago that are still dressed, so he's pulling the shroud off of her dead body now and looking at the body that he could have had when she was alive. But he's crying as he's taking the shroud off of her. And we finally see Kate Winslet's boobs as she's a dead body laying there. And she's got really nice natural boobs. Just saying. Even when she's dead. And he's looking at her body and he starts to kiss her dead body, starting with her stomach, because he loved her. And he's sort of just rubbing her face against her boobs. And then he gets up to her face. And he's staring at her face like he wants to kiss her. And then he kisses her softly on the lips and her head turns towards him and her eyes open. Like she's alive. She looks at him and she touches his face with the back of her fingers. And she takes his face in both her hands and just sort of looks at him and kisses him as he's crying still. But he can't help himself because she's a zombie. She just came back to life. That doesn't happen every day, but, you know, Jesus did, so I guess he's really into it. And he's kissing her, and his shirt is off again. It just keeps coming off. And he's now fucking her naked body. Well, she's alive now, and no longer a virgin from the look on her face. And they are having sex because he is a necrophiliac, apparently. And she's got her legs wrapped around him. And she whispers, "Don't send me away, Abbe," because she didn't want to be sent away. And she says, "Abbe, Abbe," and he comes and sees Jesus there and feels really guilty all of a sudden. And Jesus, the crucifix is crying blood. And he's like, "What the hell am I doing?" And then her body falls down and she's like all dead and ripped up again. And then he wakes up. It was all a dream. Oh, you're a necrophiliac in your dreams. And he wakes up and goes down to the Marquis's dungeon. And he's like, oh, he's used his own filth and made himself a kind of paint. The Marquis was writing in his own shit on the walls. He had to write. He couldn't be stopped. They took out his tongue, and the only thing he could write with was his own shit. And then Joaquin's like, "Get out of here. Let me deal with this. Leave me your dagger." And he takes the bandage off of the Marquis's mouth from where he had his tongue cut out. The Marquis's like clinging to the last shreds of life. And he takes out the bandage from his mouth, his tongueless mouth. And then the Marquis sort of gestures to the walls like, "So, what do you think?" Which cracks me up, and I don't know why. And he sort of smiles like, "Hey, look, my new book." And Joaquin starts doing last rites for him. And he starts praying, "Prove your infinite mercy and save this man." Joaquin wants him to be saved still. He says, no man is exempt. Forgive him. He wants him to be forgiven. Forgive us all. Oh. Stuck to his convictions. Then he dangles a cross from a rosary over the Marquis's lips and he says, kiss the cross. But then the Marquis bites his cross and chokes on it and dies. And from the director's commentary from this movie, that cross was made out of chocolate, and they got this scene in 2 takes, but they had like 50 crosses left over in case it took more than that, so the whole crew was eating chocolate crosses all day, which I think is a delightful anecdote from such a dramatic scene. The Marquis is dead now, and the priest screams, no! And now that everyone in the insane asylum is screaming. And then it fades to black, and it says, 1 year later. And there's a new priest there, and he's got curly blonde hair, and he looks like a fresh-faced young ingenue. And the doctor's there, and he's like, our endowments run down to a pittance, but the hospital has a new endeavor. His policy is each man must earn his keep. The Charenton Press. And he's got all the insane people working on a printing press of the Marquis de Sade's work. Because he was opposed to the Marquis publishing it, but now he can make money off of it and make all the insane people work for him so that he makes money and has all the Peruvian marble he wants. And he's like, oh, look, all the patients are at such peace. And he's like, yeah, they have the satisfaction of a hard day's work. So, like, he's working them to death, basically. That's their new torture. And the new priest is like, you're actually publishing the Marquis de Sade's novels? And the doctor's like, yes, well, there's been a surge of interest since his death. Might as well use these words to restore Charenton to its former glory. And the girl who didn't like Madeleine looks like she's in charge now. And she's like, oh, doctor, the German press wants a calfskin-bound edition. And he's like, oh, look, I turned a corner down in this one for you. So, like, she's his new chambermaid, I guess. And the new priest is walking around looking at, like, the opus sadicum that they're publishing. And all the patients or inmates or whatever are loading up boxes of books. So it was like less than a year later, and this guy is like profiting off of the Marquis's death. So they don't have to go through his wife anymore. And they're walking towards where the Marquis's cell was before. And the priest, he's talking to him, saying, oh, I hope you have a strong constitution. This is one of our patients prone to violence, and it's Joaquin with much longer hair in the cell. He turns to the new priest, and he's like, so you're my successor, yes? So he's gone crazy now. This is like a prequel to that Joker movie. He's like, listen to me, and listen well. I've stared into the face of evil, and I've lived to tell a tale. Now I beg you, for your sake, let me write it down. So the doctor does not give him any quills either. That's ironic. He's like, I need parchment, ink, and a quill. He really wants to write this story down, but Michael Caine's like, don't listen to him, he's crazy. And then he grabs the doctor by the collar, and he's like trying to strangle him. But the new priest is there to help, and he pries Joaquin's hand off of the doctor. And Joaquin has the Marquis's ring on his finger. He's like, do you not see, Abbe? The doctor says, do you not see, Abbe? Some men are beyond redemption. And then they walk away from Joaquin in the cell. And he's like, please bring me a quill. Please. I'm sorry. God damn you, Abbe. Well, yeah, stop attacking people, and they may eventually give you a quill. And then he just sinks down because now everything that he's done to the Marquis has happened to him. And Madeleine's mom is there, and she gives him linens, and there's parchment and a quill inside of them with ink, so he can write. And she says, use it well. You owe her that. Good for you, old blind lady. Nobody will suspect you. And then Joaquin is very happy. She's limping away as she's humming the song that Marquis would hum as he wrote. And we hear the Marquis's voice. And he says, I leave you now the tale penned by the Abbé de Coulier, or something. And he says he found salvation at the bottom of an inkwell, on the tip of a quill. And now Joaquin is humming that song as he's writing his story. However, be forewarned, its plot is blood-soaked, its characters depraved, and its themes unwholesome at best. But in order to know virtue, we must acquaint ourselves with vice. Only then can we know the full measure of man. So come, I dare you. Turn the page. And Joaquin is writing there as the credits roll. And that was Quills. I hope you enjoyed.